Hello and welcome to this video. I'm here to basically explain what exactly the European Union is, since, well, it's the first day since Britain has left the European Union, and just seeing Brexiteers on the telly and all across social media talking about, when you ask them the question, okay, what are you looking forward to from leaving the European Union? And none of them have any incoherent, proper argument for leaving. It seems to be, we've got sovereignty back, and we want to control our borders, and, all the typical Brexiteer talking points. So I'm going to cover what exactly is the EU and how it operates, because people seem to say it's undemocratic, when in theory the majority of it is democratic. I don't know how Nigel Farage managed to manipulate people into thinking it isn't democratic. So first we have the European Commission. Now what the European Commission does, in simple terms, is they are a group of people who come up with laws, legislation to be passed across European countries. This is a broad area. It could be to do with trade, it could be to do with common law, it could be to do with anything. So if we was to use an example, let's just say this example is, let's take immigration, since that's a massive talking point within the EU. But what Brexiteers feel is. So let's just say the European Commission has agreed to let 200,000 African immigrants to move to the European countries legally. So the Commission will draft this bill, and once the bill is drafted, it goes to what is called the European Parliament. Now, what the European Parliament is basically sort of how MPs work. They're called MEPs instead of MPs. That's what it was called in the UK Parliament. Now, MEPs have discussions about this legislation, and eventually they have a vote. Now, how the vote works is, I think there's 512 MEPs, I could be wrong, 705 MEPs. So how these MEPs work, right, is they are sort of sectioned off into sort of individual sort of states. So you have the British MEPs, you have France's, Germany's, Belgium's. You'll have a group of different people representing their countries within the within these talks, and they'll all come together in these small groups to say what their vote is. So if we bring it back to the African immigration, the UK will all discuss between themselves, the MEPs, and they'll come up with, well, they'll all vote, and whichever vote becomes the popular vote. So if, let's just say, 60% vote yes and 40% vote no, the UK's overall vote is yes to it. Now, when the UK vote yes to it, the European Parliament needs a majority to pass this legislation as within law. So there's 28 member states, and they need around 14 for a majority. But for a qualified majority is 55%, and for a sort of overwhelming majority, it's 65%. Now let's just say let's just say France disagreed with this immigration thing I've just came up with on the spot. Let's say they vote against it, but it has a majority in the European Parliament. Now what France can do is they can opt out of this agreement, which has happened before. In fact, I hope I pronounce this right, the Schengen Agreement was the implementation of open borders for EU countries. Now, what is interesting, at least, is a lot of them agreed to have sort of open borders between themselves, apart from Ireland and the UK. Now, what's actually really interesting is this proves the EU is not undemocratic. You may have a commission which isn't voted in, but they cannot pass laws, pass any legislation without the European Parliament, which is democratically elected, to pass their laws through into sort of the countries within the EU. And if the ones who voted no for the legislation don't want it to pass, they can opt out of this agreement. And what that means is they don't follow this agreement. So the argument Brexiteers made about England having open borders is completely false. It is a lie that the EU is making us take in immigrants. We had the option to stay in this agreement so immigrants can travel to the UK, but guess what? We never opted into it. So this agreement, which had a majority in the European Parliament, even though we didn't want it, we opted out, so we don't have to follow it. The UK doesn't have open borders currently. Now Brexiteers may argue, we want to limit immigration. You can do that in our own parliament. So this idea that Europe's forcing immigrants into the country is just so stupid, man. And this was a majority of the vote. Brexiteers don't understand what Brexit is, what the European Union is, and it's so funny. And you can see that people who are sort of in education, people who do research, people who understand and have done research on what they've actually voted for, understand that to leave the European Union is just basically causing economic sanctions upon yourself. The European Union has over 600 trade deals already agreed with countries all across the world, and let's be honest, some of the trade deals they have forbids Americans' meat into Europe, which is statistically very cancerous to people who consume that type of meat. So yeah, this is an article by The Independent. For every one student who voted leave, 6 voted remain. And this proves that people who are educated, people who've done research, may not fully understand how the EU works, but they understand the importance it is to have this sort of globalistic sort of head state to look over the rest of Europe. Now, it's just so disingenuous to say that the European Union is undemocratic just because the Commission does not, how do I put this, just because that isn't elected in doesn't mean they can pass whatever law they want. They need the European Parliament's basically consent. It needs a majority. It needs a good majority to be passed. Now, even if you voted against the law, and you don't want to be a part of this new law that's being implemented, you can opt out. Now, it's simple, 20-minute research, but because we have politicians like Boris Johnson lying about 450 million a week going to the NHS, and I guarantee the NHS will not see any bit of that funding whatsoever, because the money he's probably going to be putting, what he was putting into the EU, guess what? That's going to go to other sectors. That's going to go to policing. That's going to go to policing mainly. I think he's promised 20,000 more police, which he got rid of, which the Conservatives got rid of anyway, 10 years ago. So it's completely ridiculous. And with that money that we're saving from paying into the EU, which isn't 450 million, by the way, it's a complicated amount to get to, but whatever we invest in the EU, we get back tremendously from trading with it. Now, that 400, let's just say it is 450 million, that means we're going to have to negotiate deals across the world and try and get a benefit from the trade we already have. Let's just say we had a trade agreement with, Australia through the European Union. That trade agreement, probably a good one, because the European Union's the biggest market in the world. That's statistically a fact. I think the second's America. We're leaving to negotiate our own deal with Australia, which we could end up worse off with. We could force them to pay higher taxes, which results in certain firms just not wanting to trade with the UK anymore. It's the same with the European Union. After the withdrawal agreement, the European Union could just go, you know what? You had a decent deal when you was already with us. We didn't have to operate by the euro. We operated by our own currency, the British pound. So, it's just so funny, because now people think we're going to hold the European Union to ransom over trade if we ever do trade with them again, which they're not gonna. We're not going to hold them to account, because they're the big sort of profiting term off it. Every country within it's profiting because of the collaboration of trade. Now, could Britain realistically compose the amount of trade deals, or even more, that the European Union offer to its sort of states? It takes, the average amount of time to negotiate a trade deal is, I think it's 48 months, but some can take, 5 to 10 years. So for Britain to see a positive impact is just like, it's going to take lifetimes. And that's not to say if we collapse after it, because our entire infrastructure is built because of the European Union. When we joined it, we were doing well independently. But now our infrastructure relies on it. And yeah, that about wraps up the video. Is the EU undemocratic? No. You can easily opt out of any legislation that's passed that you don't agree with, which the UK has done in the past. Like this agreement about having open borders. It's not signed by the UK or Scotland, I believe. It's not signed by England or Scotland. So that was just... See, it's a complete lie that the EU is undemocratic. We vote in our MEPs. They vote for whatever they think the British people want. But yeah, you have liars like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson who basically want to make the UK a tax haven for Americans and themselves, which will heavily impact the poor in Britain, because now the sort of cheap trading options are now probably going to go away after the withdrawal stage of the Brexit, I guess. So yeah, this is just a small video and rant about how the EU actually operates, and just the lies, really, that's being told by our politicians, which isn't surprising. I think everyone knows politicians lie, but when they use words like, stopping immigration, it really sort of downplays to poorer people in society to push forward and vote on these regulations, because they believe immigrants are the enemy, when in reality the real enemy are these politicians, ripping them off, siding with big corporations, and just doing anything in their power to basically constrain workers into poor conditions. Like, I'll even find it now about workers' rights that we aren't implementing from outside the European Union. What's basically happened is one of the workers' rights that we get from the EU, one of them isn't being implemented after. So we aren't sure what policy they aren't bringing over. Yeah, I've got it on another monitor. So we aren't sure. We are not sure which law isn't being brought over because, well, we're in the withdrawal stage. So everything's been negotiated following this year. So yeah, it's weird, because if you don't know what workers' rights means, it means stuff like maternity leave if you're pregnant, it means holiday pay, it means sick pay, it means employers not being able to basically fire you without sort of a valid reason. One of them isn't being sort of brought over with the EU agreement, which we opted into, not out. So yeah, this is basically it for the video. Mini rant. So is the EU undemocratic? It's as democratic as our parliament. Let's just say that. Alright, please subscribe and like if you like the video. I'll see you in the next one.